Well, it's difficult to imagine the horrors that took place in Auschwitz in the Second World War. Obviously not because it's difficult to understand, but because of just how gut-wrenching the stories are that have come out since the war ended, as we've learned more about what went on there. But with the horrors that went on within the walls of Auschwitz, to set the context, these words that were found written on one of the walls in Auschwitz, I think, seem that much more incredible. There is grace, though, and wonder along the way. Only they are hard to see, hard to embrace, for those compelled to wander in darkness. Of course, this isn't the only time in history that the Jews have been targeted and persecuted. In the first century, while things obviously looked very different, I don't think it's a huge stretch to imagine the Jewish people at the time feeling like they too were compelled to wander in darkness. Rome was the superpower of the day, in control of the entire region, and while they weren't exactly rounding up Jews and putting them in concentration camps, there was political tension that from time to time would boil over and get quite messy. In spite of everything that the prophets had said about restoration, about renewal, about God coming in to restore his kingdom, about a rebuilt and glorious temple that God would come to dwell in once more, the facts of the matter is that none of this had happened like they were expecting. They might have been living in their own land, but they weren't in control of it. And while there was no shortage of opinions about what God might be up to, what God might be doing in all of this, what needed to happen for him to intervene, to liberate them from the Romans, to reestablish his kingdom, although there were a lot of opinions about that, the bottom line is that it just wasn't that clear what God was doing. Until, to a people compelled to wander in darkness, a light shone in the darkness. John 1 verse 9, the true light, who gives light to all of humanity, came into the world. That's the moment that we're going to be building up to today. That moment's in John 1 verse 9. But before we get there, it'd be good for us to back up to verse 4 and get some of the context to see where this light is first mentioned. So let's think first together about the light that shines in the darkness. We'll mainly be looking at verses 4 and 5. Throughout the Bible story, darkness is used as a metaphor for a number of things. But there are two main ones that I want us to think about this morning. In the Old Testament, darkness often represents God's judgment. That's the first one that I want us to think about. God's judgment, God's curse, being separated from God, and the desolation that comes with that. Perhaps the most significant moment of that is when in the Old Testament, Israel, or more specifically the southern kingdom, Judah, went into exile in Babylon. In Isaiah 42, this is spoken of as a prison cell, a dungeon where they were consigned to sit in darkness. Related to this is another thing that darkness represents in the Bible, which is not just our circumstances, but ourselves. Not just our situation, but our sin. This is actually the main way that John uses this metaphor of darkness through his gospel. It's a sense of ignorance, of not knowing how God is at work, or being attentive to his will, or being in tune with his plans and purposes. But it isn't just ignorance, plain and simple, as if we just didn't know. The cosmos testifies to the fact that it had a creator. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. In Romans 1, the Apostle Paul says that through creation, God has shown us his divine nature and eternal power such that we have no excuse. And here in John's gospel, the Pharisees saw for themselves how Jesus demonstrated this same power as he brought healing to the sick, food to the hungry, and life to the dead. It isn't that they didn't know. It's that they didn't want to know. Or the way that John explains it in chapter 3, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. See, the thing is, we choose darkness. And if we're honest, we quite like it there. We're quite comfortable sitting in darkness. So on the one hand, we have darkness that represents God's judgment, separation from God, exile. On the other, we have our own darkness within, our sin, our willed ignorance. But it is worth saying that these aren't two separate, unrelated realities. The two are actually closely connected. If we walk away from the light, we can't be surprised when we find ourselves in darkness. If I turn the light on in the lounge and walk down the passage into the bedroom, I can't be surprised when I can't see what I'm doing. I think it's the same sort of idea here. If we walk away from the light and the life that's found in God, we can't be surprised when we find ourselves in darkness, in exile, separated from his life and presence. What we'll find is that it's judgment, it's death, and that we've chosen it for ourselves. That's where God's people found themselves in the first century. To be sure, by the time that Jesus arrived on the scene, they weren't in Babylon anymore. They'd returned home, they'd rebuilt the temple, they'd rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, they tried to rekindle the community to the best they could, but Rome was very much in charge. They were still under foreign rule, and they just hadn't seen the sort of restoration and renewal and glory that they were expecting, that the prophets had told them that they could expect. They might be back in their own land, but for all intents and purposes, they were still in exile. And in all this, the Jewish people were far from unified. There were a number of sects, all with different ideas about what God might be up to, what he might be doing, what needed to happen for God to return and to liberate them, to reestablish his kingdom. The bottom line was, and what they could all agree on, I think, is that they were still in darkness. They still weren't in the presence of God. They were still waiting for God to act. And in John 1 verse 5, that is what he does. The light shines in the darkness, which actually might call to mind another verse from Isaiah. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And what is that light? Well, later in that chapter, we read those famous words, "To us a child is born, to us a son is given. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." So when you come back to John's Gospel, what we expect him to say next is, there came a man sent by God, his name was Jesus. We expect him to say Jesus. There came a man sent by God, his name was Jesus. But that's not what he says. Instead, he says his name was John. So that's the second thing we're going to look at this morning, a man whose name was John. I can't help but wonder, why John? It seems a bit of a random detour. We're Christians, not Baptists. There came a man sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all would believe in him. He was not the light, but came to testify concerning the light. And I'm thinking, yes, I know he's not the light. I was expecting you to say Jesus. Why are we here? Well, part of the answer, I think, comes from realizing just how much of a stir this John guy caused in the first century. He arrived on the scene as a prophet, calling to people to repent of their sin. He attracted a significant following, a following that stayed together even after he died. I mentioned earlier that at the time, Judaism was actually quite fractured, and arriving on the scene, proclaiming a baptism of repentance would have been taken not as a challenge only to what they were doing, but also a challenge to the temple system and what was going on there. Later on in John 1, the Jewish leaders sent priests and Levites to find out more about this guy, and later he was imprisoned and ultimately put to death by King Herod. He was seen as a political force to be reckoned with, somebody who they couldn't just leave alone. As it turns out, this John guy was quite a big deal. He was quite a prominent figure, and because he had such a following, because he caused such a stir, it actually makes sense that John, the author, would take a moment to say something about him. It's easy for us to brush past John the Baptist because we know that, well, the person we want to get to is Jesus. But for the people living then in the first century, the people who would have been reading John's gospel for the first time, it actually makes a lot of sense that John the author would take a moment to say, there was this guy named John. You've probably heard of him. You've probably heard quite a lot about him. He was not the light, but he did testify to the light. And that actually is a nice segue into the part that John had to play in God's plans and purposes, because that was also quite important. To a people sitting in exile in Babylon, just rewinding for a moment, to a people sitting in exile in Babylon, Isaiah said these words, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." A voice of one calling, in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert highway a path for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low, the rough ground shall be made level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. John then might not be the light himself, but he was that voice crying out in the wilderness. He's the one who sets the stage, who tells us that what God had promised, the restoration, the renewal that they were expecting, the deliverance from sitting in the darkness of the dungeon, it was all happening because the messenger is on the scene. He is the messenger, the voice crying out in the wilderness that Isaiah spoke about. And John appearing is a sign that God's plan for restoration is unfolding. A light has shone in the darkness, and John is here to tell us that. In chapter 5, Jesus talked about how John was a lamp that burned for a while. Also testified to the truth, like Jesus said that he has come to do in 18 verse 37. But he's a lamp that will burn for a while and then flicker and fade. Whereas Jesus is the light itself, the light of the world, who gives light to all of humanity, like he says in chapter 8. And so that brings us to the verse that we've been building up to. Verse 9. The true light that came into the world, the true light that gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. John came as God's messenger to a people in exile, sitting in darkness, that God is finally bringing the darkness to an end. And the way that God is doing that is by sending the light of the world into the world to dispel the darkness altogether. But it is worth saying that he didn't do this just for Israel. He did that for everybody. Look again at verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone, to all people, was coming into the world. He came for us too, and for anybody who would receive him. You see, the thing is, all of us, at least at one time, were separated from God. All of us, at one time, turned our backs on him. And all of us, at least at one time, walked away from the light that he gives. All of us were, at least at one time, in darkness. And if we're honest, we quite liked it there. It isn't just that we didn't know about God, it's that we didn't want to know about God. The way that John Piper puts it, sin is what you do when your heart is not satisfied with God. No one sins out of a sense of duty. We sin because it holds out some promise of happiness. That promise enslaves us until we believe that God is more to be desired than life itself. Maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you haven't turned to Jesus. Maybe you are still sitting in darkness. And maybe you know you're sitting in darkness. And if you're quite honest, you quite like it there. If that's you, can I urge you to take another look into the light? Can I urge you to reconsider? You might think you like walking around in the dark. You might feel safe walking around in the dark. Like we saw earlier in John 3, we don't like walking into the light because we feel exposed in the light. You might feel like you know where you're going. But the fact of the matter is, in the dark, you can't see things the way they actually are. It might feel like safety and comfort and not being exposed, but it's a prison cell. And when the lights come on, you'll see that. Jesus says in John 12, you're going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark doesn't know where they are going. Believe in the light while you still have the light, so that you may become children of the light. Don't leave it. Turn on the lights. Turn to Jesus. And do it today. Come speak to me. Come speak to Luke. Come speak to Rolt. Turn to Jesus. Turn on the light. And if you want to know how to do that, come speak to us. Maybe you're sitting here today and you have turned to Jesus. You are walking in the light. Can I encourage you to keep going? To keep walking. As John says in 12 verse 36, become children of the light. Paul actually uses a similar phrase in Ephesians 5. And he says this, once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So live as children of the light. Carefully determine what pleases the Lord. Take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them. Be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but live like those who are wise. It is worth saying that it isn't like a light switch, either on or off. There will be days where it feels like the light is dim. Days where we feel low, distant from God, defeated by our sin. And the fact of the matter is, until Jesus returns, that's a reality that we have to live with. Until Jesus returns and dispels every bit of darkness, there will still be shadows in our hearts. There will still be corners where we need to ask Jesus to shine his light. We can be sure that if we turn to Jesus, shadows and all, he promises that he will never let us go. Even in your darkest moments, Jesus is there with you. Even in your darkest moments, Jesus will not let you go. But I think that should give us even greater resolve to ask him to shine his light in those corners where the shadows lie. That might mean reaching out to somebody about talking to somebody you trust, having an open, honest conversation about where you're at, and maybe talk together about a way forward. What walking in the light might look like for you. That doesn't mean advertising your sin. One writer, I forget who, he said, tell everybody that you sin. Tell a few trusted people how you sin. But don't delay. Bring it out into the light. Sin hates company. When we talk about it, it gives us an opportunity to put it to death. It gives us an avenue for Jesus to shine his light into those corners of our hearts. Sin is what you do when your heart is not satisfied with God. Sin is what happens when we get comfortable in the dark, We find our nice, cozy little corner of the prison cell and decide that we're content to sell ourselves short. Christmas is a reminder that we don't have to do that. We don't have to sell ourselves short. We aren't compelled to wander in darkness. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness hasn't overcome it. The true light, who gives light to all of humanity, has come into the world. And so this Advent season, can I encourage you to look into the light, to turn to Jesus, to behold his glory afresh, or perhaps for the first time, the glory of the Father's one and only Son.